Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome on this very sunny afternoon. On behalf of Passaporta, the Goethe Institute, and the publisher Atlas Contact, I'm very happy to welcome you to this conversation with Nino Haratischwili, a novelist, stage director, theater author, who writes in German, but is primarily known for her novels that relate to her native country, Georgia, in the Caucasus. In Germany, she caught attention with novels like Zsuzsa in 2010 and Mein sanfter Zwilling, My Gentle Twin, from 2011. But her breakthrough novel is Das achte Leben, The Eighth Life, from 2014, already a while ago, but now translated in Dutch, Het achtste leven voor Brilka, bij Atlas Contact. It has been published last year, and it has found a large audience of readers who have been swept away by the story. People who have made time free in their calendars to read it for weeks, because it's a big book. It's more than 1,000 pages, and rightly so. They have reserved time for it because it's a fantastic, imaginative, sweeping story, but also a wise book. Welcome, Nino, to Passaporta and to Brussels.
Thank you.
Das achte Leben from 2014, an epic, ambitious book. I would say it's almost like a 19th century book, but it's about the 20th century. Entirely, literally. It starts in the beginning of the 20th century and it ends more or less at the end of the 20th century. And it's about Georgia and much more than Georgia, but also about the history of a country that is not so well known, I guess, in the Western world. My first question I would like to ask, Nino, is what was your impulse to write it? What was the initial idea behind starting to write a novel with such big panoramic historical background?
Yes, good afternoon, and thanks for inviting me. I never thought that I would sit down and write a novel for, I don't know, more than 1,000 pages. I didn't really plan it. It was somehow I wanted to write a novel, of course, about my home country, and I wanted to write a novel about a family. Yeah. And the period I wanted to focus was just like it was 90s, because this period was really tough in Georgia. I grew up at the time. It was this post-perestroika time. It was, there have been civil wars and inflation and great unemployment. The society
and conflict, in fact, and bloody conflict.
That's a violent time, and the society just like fell apart at the time, and it had a great influence on everybody who lived that time. I was a child, a teenager, but so I remember a lot of things. So I wanted to write about that time. And as I started writing, I realized, of course, I knew, okay, I'm writing German, so first of all for German audience. And I thought, okay, it's so chaotic, nobody's going to understand what's happening there, because it was just like an ending of an era, of a century, of a period, also political things, just like the Soviet period. So I had to travel in time, and then I started to read about 80s and 70s, and it became... I was really catched by so many information, so many things that I discovered, because I also didn't really know a lot of things, because my understanding of the 20th century was also more just like influenced by the Western point of view. So I knew, for example, much more about the National Socialism than communism. And because this analysis of the history has never been done in Georgia or in the post-Soviet countries.
So in a way you could say that the book caught you by surprise as well, that you started writing with a small idea, I'm going to write about the 90s, and then it erupted mostly.
Yes, then I ended up at the October Revolution, and I was just like, okay.
That's a long time ago.
Are you sure that you're going to write about such a long period? But then I was really, I couldn't really stop, because I was like in Alice in Wonderland, you know, I was discovering, or for me it's also a good example, just like being in a in a building or in a house with a lot of doors. So every time I thought, okay, I've been already in all the rooms, I've discovered one more and one more and one more. So I could not really stop, so I just continued.
But that's fascinating about the place where you're writing from, I would say. Georgia, Tbilisi. Okay, you are in Germany when you start writing the book, but you go back to that place to write about it. But then, of course, it's not a tiny place somewhere far away. It has really connections with a large part of the world, I would say, especially through what you then write in the book a lot about is the history of the Soviet Union.
Yes, because of course Georgian history, not only of the 20th century, even before, but of course especially of the last century, is so much connected with the Soviet one, the Russian one, and the Russian or Soviet one is connected to the world history. So you cannot really write something separately. You always have to check out the context. So that's why this stuff and material becomes so huge, and that's why this book also becomes so huge. Yes.
Yeah, but it starts with ordinary people, I would say, living in Georgia around the time of the Russian Revolution to begin with. One family, the Yashi family, and then what is interesting is what you do with the connection between the small history of people's lives and the big history. There's some interesting intermingling between the two. Perhaps you could say a few words about that. There are big historical characters who play a role in your book, but the focus is really on the normal people.
Because I guess that you can really get this big history by individual human biographies, because when you read some terrible stuff, just like so many people were sent to gulags and so many people died there, just like I don't know, more than 1 million, it stays or 6 million or 300,000, it stays kind of anonymous. You cannot really understand, you cannot even imagine, somehow, but it stays theoretically. So for me it was also a way to get into this issue, so get close to this historical things by individual ways and individual lives. So it was also helpful for me to understand things a little bit better.
Yeah, and so the individualize you make very specific. We follow these persons in detail, but then the big historical figures somehow loom in the background. Of course, Stalin, I think, is the most notorious figure in the background, Georgian descent. And then, of course, you cannot avoid writing something about him, but then he stays really in the background. That was a conscious choice, I imagine.
Yeah, Stalin, but the more important character is Lavrenti Beria. In the book, he is called Little Big Man, yes. Yeah. And he was kind of right hand of Stalin, also Georgian. He was the head of the NKVD. Yeah. It's just like the KGB of it's a period, and he was responsible for the Stalinistic purge in the 30s, and he was the head of the Georgian Communist Party, and yes, a murderer and a really terrible man. So it was. I tried to, because it was the challenge how you write about a historical person, how you write about murderer, and not judge him or not, because of course for me it's also terrible, unimaginable, but it was helpful that I discovered, he had a lot of just like love affairs, and I even met an old woman, she was 19 then, and she told me that he was her lover. Mm-hmm. Even 50 years after his death, she was sitting there drinking tea and eating cake with me and talking how great he was and what a nice gentleman. And I was a little bit shocked because I thought, okay, this person is just like, he's responsible for hundreds and thousands and almost like million of lives and the death of all these people. And
Stalin called him our Himmler. So
yes. Somehow, but it was helpful. Of course, I was a little bit shocked, but afterwards I realized, okay, this is the right way. I have to write about him from the point of view of this woman, from somebody else, because then I don't really. I have a chance not to judge, not to write my opinion about him, because that's the most difficult thing. Because of course I have my own opinion. I have my own, just like I don't want to write.
Yeah, you want to condemn him, but on the page something
but
different becomes to life. Yeah.
But literature is, I think it's not about that.
And indeed, there is a kind of love relationship. How twisted it is between Christine, one of your characters, and this little big man who you never, I think, mention by name, right? Or do you? I don't remember exactly.
Stalin and he, yes, I don't mention them till just like the last page. Yep. And they afterwards they're being revealed by a joke from the 30s. It's not quite funny joke, I guess. It's a little bit, not little bit, it's quite sarcastic or ironic. But yes, it was just like, in Harry Potter, when you don't spell this name of the... because Nita has to tell the whole history, she has to... And after telling that, after just kind of healing herself maybe, she's able to name them, and then they don't have the power. But still, these both persons have a huge impact on the history, in Eastern history, and unfortunately. So I wanted her to pass the whole century, and afterwards she's able to, yes, kind of just like by telling these jokes, they're losing their power. Yeah. That was the idea behind that.
And was that informed by the conversation you had with that lady who actually had this encounter with Beria? Or is the research not so direct into the novel, reflected into the novel?
I had a lot of interviews, not only with her. Because I started writing and then I started reading a lot of books, but at some point I realized it's not enough to read. I have to go to all the places. And I was lucky enough, I got a kind of scholarship from Germany. It's called, just like it's only for doing some research from authors for Eastern Europe. So I could just like, I quitted everything, all the other work. And 1 year I was traveling around, and I also did a lot of archive work, and most of the time I've spent in Russia, and but also Georgia. And yes, I did a lot of interviews. One of that was this old lady. She was helpful only for deciding how I deal with this person, how I can describe him, how can I let him appear in the book. But the decision not to mention both of these persons by names, it was just like right from the beginning, because I knew, okay, I want to... It's just like how she's writing in the prologue. Nita, she has to cross the whole century.
Yeah.
And
also it makes it perhaps more universal as well, the story to some extent, perhaps.
Maybe, yes. Yeah. Yes.
Okay, so now we mentioned the 20th century and the cruelty that is obviously part of the novel, since you have to write about Stalin and the 30s, and you have to write about the Second World War and about the conflict in the 90s. You write about Beria and the atrocities in the Secret Service and all of that. It's quite a heavy story on the surface, a story of extremes. It seems you also, at some point of the book, try to tell the beauty of the 20th century, even from the very beginning, with an important sweet part in the book, and that is chocolate. Perhaps you can say a little bit about, the contrast between bitterness and sweetness in, balancing that story of the 20th century.
Yeah, that was also a challenge because, of course, it's a really cruel century, and there have been so many cruel things that I had to deal with when I was writing and working on it. There have been also some days when I just quitted writing and said, why I'm doing that. I felt so useless and helpless, and it's kind of really disappointing, and yeah, I don't know, it makes one depressed. But on the other hand, you have so many people who've been fighting and struggling for the individual, just like happiness and trying to change things. And for me, it was important to show that also, that it's not only just like, okay, it's gray and it's terrible and it's hopeless. Chocolate, yes, the chocolate thing was, it was, in the beginning, I didn't really meant to have this chocolate so important, or just like a red line through the whole book. It became afterwards, while writing, it became more and more important. But in the beginning, I wanted to start this book with something sensual, something nice, something beautiful, because I knew, okay, now I am afterwards, 1921, it was in Georgia, it's going to change, and Soviet period is nothing that you can really associate with sensuality or
nothing from
or big
not immediately,
beauty,
let's say.
yes. And I thought I like the idea to start with something that most of the people like, and it was important that it's something that this one generation can give it to another.
Yeah.
So this is a recipe of this hot chocolate, and most of the people like chocolate, so it's kind of
So it's something very literal in the book. So the grandfather passes a recipe of very nice chocolate to the daughter, and so on and so forth. But that it's also a metaphor, I understand.
Yeah, it's a metaphor, and the importance of this chocolate it was because while I was writing and working on it and doing some interviews with people who lived at different times and periods in Soviet Union, people often mentioned the word fate or destiny. They said, okay, I could not change anything because it was kind of fate, it was destiny, there always been kind of power above themselves, about just, I don't know, God or destiny or Kremlin. So I start wondering what this word means to me. Mm-hmm. Do we believe in that, my generation, or people just like living now in, liberal society, and we live in a Western society, we live in the illusion that you can change everything by your efforts, and your life is just like in your hands, and you can do whatever you want. And it was just like a question, and I don't think that I found an answer, because it always stays a matter of interpretation and the point of view from which you look at your life or things from in your life. But this question became more and more important, so I just wanted to question it also the readers, because while I was doing the research, I could not really find an answer.
What's the link with chocolate there, or not really? Is chocolate a metaphor for something you get from your ancestors?
Some of the characters believe that it's just like it's what's the English word for Fluch? Verflucht? It's
we hear a choir of voices from the audience. So
an echo. Cursed, yes, cursed.
Verflucht, okay, yeah. It's a curse.
So, and some of damned or cursed, and people believe that when you drink it, or then that something terrible is going to happen. And some of them they say, okay, it's silly. It nothing has to do with the chocolate. It's just like the life. It's politics. It's so on. So I think both point of views maybe are right. I don't know. There's no wrong or right in the case, and I didn't really could answer that question, because this was the whole time while doing research. In almost every case, I faced this versions of do I believe in that or I don't? I'm not quite sure, because of course it's understandable that people lived in this dictatorship, in this, while that period you could not change anything. You were just like, as an individual, you didn't really count. So.
And then suddenly things happen. You write about the Prague Spring, for example, and sometimes, you know, there's activism or people going to war. They think they can change history, and then you get the opposite side.
Yes.
It's activism. It's not the.
So this is. I think
yep.
it's not only a question that it's just like something from the past. Of course, nowadays I also ask myself these questions in different situations,
sure.
of course, but somehow it stays actually.
Yeah. When you were doing research for the book and when you were really delving more and more into the distant past, were there things that you discovered that you say, well, I didn't know that, and that is really an element now in the book that surprised me too?
Yes, so many things. Almost everything.
Everything.
I was like a child, you know, in a toy store that you, oh my God, and that's also important. Oh my God, that happened. Oh yes, I have to use it, and it was really exciting, and of course also terrible things. Just like people often in Germany, some readers, they came and they were just like complaining that it's a little bit too cruel, or there are too many torture scenes. Why do I have to write them? And my answer is always, I cannot write about this issue, about this history, and spare them out, because it, for example, all the cruelty, all the torture scenes, all the violence that I've described in that book is inspired by the reality. Yeah. I didn't really, of course, it's a fiction and I somehow invented things, but it's always inspired by the reality. I cannot write something that it didn't happen already. Yeah. So I somehow felt that it has to be, yes. Unfortunately, it has to be. Of course, I also didn't really write things like that, but I think it's important to.
Did you also do research in your own family history? It's a family history that we get in the book. Did you, or is it really very far apart from what you?
It's not really autobiographical. Just it's not the way that I really wrote about my family members, but there are a lot of things, just for example, the 90s, that are really, it also happened in my family, or that was also a problem in my family, because I think that was really, it didn't really depend on the, when you lived at the time in Georgia, every person was impacted or influenced by the history I mean literally.
And then you mean the chaotic structure of the government, the corruption, I guess.
Yes, the criminality, violence, yes, and so on. And there have been a lot of things that I've described that from that period that I really remember, of course. And yes, it was also in my family kind of present, but the characters are not really related to.
So there's not a lot of your own direct memories in the book, or are there? I can imagine, for example, there's a big scene in '89 with the protests and so on. You were very young then, obviously, but perhaps some memories survive.
There are a lot of memories, but not really kind of. It's not just like I've written down some things that I really did or
it's not a report
experienced,
of your,
but there are some memories of just like this atmosphere, the situation, people, how they were dealing with things, because that time it showed up, people showed up, it forced people to show themselves in a really extreme way. I mean in a positive but also negative way. So people become really violent and really cruel, and the crime become kind of part of everyday life. But on the other hand, people were so helpful and tried to help each other because they knew it's the only way to survive. And of course, my memories, I have a lot of memories. They also kind of, I've written them down in the book, but just like, for example, that I could not really go to a window at the New Year's Eve. It was in the beginning of 90s because there were some shootings. And
this was in Tbilisi, where you
in Tbilisi, yes,
where you
because
grew
it
up,
was civil war, and almost just like every guy could have a Kalashnikov or a gun, and they were shooting around just like, I don't know. And I thought as a child, I thought it's firework and it's great, and I wanted to go to. And my mother was screaming, "No, don't!" And but all the things, this is what I mean, that it really it happened in every family, or every family has memories like that.
Yeah. In a while, I would like to go a little bit deeper into these protagonists of the story and the characters and the resilience, as you describe it, and the way they deal with the big history.
You have water?
Some water? Yes, the water is here. But before we go into that, it would be nice to hear a bit of the book in German. And perhaps to introduce it, you have to say perhaps a little bit about the setup of the book. So the story is told by someone to someone, and we get a little bit of a glimpse of that in the fragment here that you will read. So perhaps before you read it, perhaps a little bit explain where we are in the story. We're right in the beginning, but
it's a short part of the prologue, so the beginning of the book, and the whole story is told by Nitsa. Nitsa is just like the 5th generation of this Joshi family. It's a family history told just like during the whole 20th century, and she is she tells the story from the perspective of just like present perspective, and she's telling it to her niece Brilka. And it's kind of a letter. It's just like a really long letter written to someone. So
and Brilka is born in the early 90s, or
yes.
Yeah,
93,
right?
Yes, 93.
And so Nitsa, the person who is reading the story, is born in
73. Yes, 73, and she's telling the whole story to Brilka, and why she's telling and so on. It would be too complicated to tell now, but yes, she addresses the whole thing to her. Yeah.
Great. Let's listen to the fragment then.
Yes, the prologue starts just like in present days, and then go back to just the beginning of the 20th century, and then it goes through just like the whole century.
Yep.
Ich heiße Nitsa. In meinem Namen ist ein Wort enthalten, ein Wort, das in unserer Muttersprache Himmel bedeutet, Za. Vielleicht war mein bisheriges Leben die Suche nach diesem einen Himmel, den man mir schon von Geburt an als Versprechen mit auf den Weg gegeben hatte. Meine Schwester hieß Daria. In ihrem Namen ist das Wort Chaos enthalten, Aria. Das Zerwühlen und Aufwühlen, das Durcheinanderbringen und nicht mehr zurechtrücken. Ich bin ihr verpflichtet, ich bin ihrem Chaos verpflichtet. Ich bin schon immer verpflichtet gewesen, in ihrem Chaos meinen Himmel zu suchen. Vielleicht geht es aber auch um Brilka. Deren Name in der Sprache meiner Kindheit nichts bedeutet, deren Name unbeschriftet ist und unstigmatisiert. Und auch wenn ich es dir nie gesagt habe, ich würde dir dabei so gern helfen, Brilka, so unglaublich gern, deine Geschichte anders und neu zu schreiben. Ich verdanke diese Zeilen einem Jahrhundert, das alle betrogen und hintergangen hat, alle die hofften. Ich verdanke diese Zeilen einem lange andauernden Verrat, der sich wie ein Fluch über meine Familie gelegt hatte. Ich verdanke diese Zeilen meiner Schwester, der ich nie verzeihen konnte, dass sie in jener Nacht ohne Flügel losgeflogen ist. Meinem Großvater, dem meine Schwester das Herz herausgerissen hat. Meiner Urgroßmutter, die mit mir ein Pas de deux tanzte, als sie 83 war. Meiner Mutter, die Gott suchte. Ich verdanke diese Zeilen Miro, der mich mit Liebe wie mit einem Gift infizierte. Ich verdanke diese Zeilen meinem Vater, den ich nie wirklich kennenlernen durfte. Ich verdanke diese Zeilen einem Schokoladenfabrikanten und einem weißroten Oberleutnant, einer Gefängniszelle, aber auch einem Operationstisch mitten in einem Klassenraum, einem Buch, das ich nie geschrieben hätte, wenn. Ich verdanke diese Zeilen unendlich vielen vergossenen Tränen. Ich verdanke diese Zeilen mir selber, die die Heimat verließ, um sich zu finden und sich doch zunehmend verlor. Ich verdanke aber diese Zeilen vor allem dir, Brilka. Ich verdanke sie dir, weil du das 8. Leben verdienst. Weil man sagt, dass die Zahl 8 gleichgesetzt ist mit der Ewigkeit, mit dem wiederkehrenden Fluss. Ich schenke dir meine 8. Uns verbindet ein Jahrhundert, ein rotes Jahrhundert, auf immer und 8. Du bist dran, Brilka. Ich habe dein Herz adoptiert, ich habe meines weggeschleudert. Nimm meine 8 an. Du bist das Zauberkind, du bist es. Durchbrich den Himmel und das Chaos, durchbrich uns alle. Durchbrich diese Zeilen, durchbrich die Gespensterwelt und die wirkliche Welt, durchbrich die Umkehrung der Liebe, des Glaubens. Verkürzt die Zentimeter, die uns immer vom Glück trennten. Durchbrich das Schicksal, das keines war. Durchbrich mich und dich. Durchlebe alle Kriege und alle Grenzen. Ich widme dir alle Götter und Rosenkränze, alle Verbrennungen, alle geköpften Hoffnungen, alle Geschichten. Durchbreche sie, denn du hast die Mittel dazu, Brilka. Die 8, denk dran. In dieser Zahl werden wir alle für immer miteinander verwoben sein und immer einander lauschen können durch die Jahrhunderte hindurch. Du wirst es können. Sei alles, was wir waren und nicht waren. Sei ein Leutnant, eine Seiltänzerin, eine Matrose, eine Schauspielerin, ein Filmemacher, eine Pianistin, eine Geliebte, eine Mutter, eine Krankenschwester, eine Schriftstellerin. Sei rot und weiß oder blau, sei Chaos und Himmel, sei sie und ich. Sei all das nicht. Tanze vor allem unzählige Pas de deux. Durchbrich diese Geschichte und lass sie hinter dir.
Thank you. Yes. So, heaven and chaos, and it captures a century, but it also captures, I guess, some of the characters in the book. Would you say that there is some talent among the people you describe for surviving totalitarianism, or some element in there, some way of dealing with the horrible situation they have been encountered by living in Georgia in the Soviet Union?
I tried to describe different characters. I tried to describe, of course, they're kind of really extreme biographies, extreme people, but it was more interesting for the dramaturgy of the book, of course. And I wanted to show the different ways that people were dealing with that regime and the history. There are some, just like Kostya, he really does believe in that regime, he does believe in communism, and he's just like devoting his whole life to this, to the state, and till the end he fights for that. Even he's doing terrible things, but he does them because he's sure that it's right. Yep. His sister is the complete opposite, of course, someone who is who's fighting and trying to live an individual way, who wants to be free, who wants to make decisions for herself and not someone else. Then there is a mother who is Stasia, who is kind of fleeing in a virtual world, in a world of dreams, because she does not really have the power to change things and kind of accepting her destiny or fate. And then Christine, she's doing I think it's a really cruel. There's a lot of cruelty and violence that is happening to her and changing her forever, of course. So I just like tried to describe different ways of dealing with this so ideology and historical stuff, and because of course there have been victims, but there have also been a lot of people who had they believed in what was happening. They believed in that, and they were
So it seems you break down a bit of the binary victim-perpetrator image, the cliches. They're not cliches, they're much more, they're richer characters in a way, the way you describe them, even though they are obviously at some point at the wrong side of history. Do you think that, did you have the idea that you wanted to create some compassion for even the more cruel figures in the book, or would that be a little bit too extreme to say?
I didn't want to judge, because it's really easy to do that. So, and of course, as a human being, we all do that, and I also did. And before I wrote this book, I was really angry about a lot of things happened in Georgia or are still happening, and I didn't really wanted to understand, because I thought it's, yes, why didn't you fought against it, or why didn't you tried something?
Yeah.
And after this book, I become kind of a little bit, yes, maybe more compassionate, yes, about things. So because it's easy to say I would not act this way, but you never know. So I was lucky enough to be born in the end of the period, because it's also a huge difference. The Soviet Union in the 30s and Soviet Union in the 80s. So I cannot really say to my grandmother, for example, why didn't you just, I don't know, act this way, or demonstrate it, or try to be like, I don't know, Kitty or something, because people, they had to pay a really, really terrible price sometimes for their,
And it has to navigate very difficult circumstances, obviously. Yeah.
So I guess so. Yes, I guess I didn't really want people to be. Yes, I didn't really try to understand the psychology of just like a mass murder, like Beria, but I wanted to try to go as close as possible to some events, some situations, some historical moments. Yes.
Is there any character in the book that you have some sort of special admiration for, that you think, well, this is somehow developed beyond my control into a person that I really started to become, a fan of or an admirer of?
I cannot say that I'm a fan of somebody, but of course there are some characters that for me it was really interesting. He's not a central person, just main character. He's not even a family member, but I really, for me it was interesting to work on this character, Georgi Alania. He's a friend of Kostya, and this was also a chapter of the Soviet history. I didn't really know about it, nothing, and this. Repatriation, it was called. I guess it's the right word in English. It was KGB department, and there have been some people sent abroad after the Second World War, and they were meant to find Soviet citizens, stayed outside the Soviet Union, and bring them back, and even violently bring them back. And most of them, they were been sent to gulags, or they've been just like, murdered by Stalin in the 50s. So it was a really terrible chapter of the history, but I like this really ambiguous character of him, because he's on one hand he's doing terrible things. On the other, he becomes a kind of an angel, and he helps Kitty to survive. So it was interesting for me.
Yeah. Do you, when you write about these, ambiguous characters that have good sides and do terrible things sometimes, or do good things but are terrible persons, when it goes back to Georgia, so you write this a lot about Georgia, but from the perspective of, or in Germany and in German, I can imagine that it's more sensitive to the reader in Georgia than perhaps to the reader in Germany. I don't know, especially when it comes to this good versus bad thing. So perhaps you can tell me a little bit about the reception of that particular writing of history and that multi-perspective thing in Georgia. Did you have any responses from there?
It's this book has been not published yet in Georgia.
It's even not published
yet.
Uh-huh.
So,
which is a sign in itself, perhaps, or
no? It was it's a really huge. It's a big drama with translation and lecturer and so on, editors. It was not meant that way, but somehow it happened that it had been postponed for just like, I don't know, 4 times. Yeah. So now they want to publish it in May, so I do hope that it's going to happen, because I know there's a lot of interest and people are writing and asking and calling the publishing house, because now they kind of heard about it.
I can imagine, I can imagine that people know about the book and know what's inside the book already before it's even translated into Georgian.
Yes,
and how do they respond to it?
It's a big curiosity, and I'm also excited when it's going to happen and it's going to be published, what the reaction is going to be. But one interesting thing was that this book has been staged in Hamburg in theater.
Okay.
It's a stage adaptation for just like it lasts for 5 hours, and
it's a big book, so now I know.
And it's a huge success. I'm really thankful. It's a huge success in Hamburg, and it's still they're playing it. It's still in repertoire, and they had guest performance with this performance in Tbilisi this last September. So I also went there, and it was so exciting. I was really, I've never been so excited about nothing. Yeah. And it was,
a big thing,
it was, I don't know why, but it for me it was just like Brilka coming home. Yeah. It felt like that. So and the theater, there have been more than 1,000 people, and I thought, okay, no Georgian is going to stay there for 5 hours with, it's just like in German with Georgian subtitles, yes. And I thought they're not going to
it's a bit of an effort,
there
yes.
But nobody went out, and it was really emotional, because a lot of things, that also is a lot of documentary video stuff in this performance, and it was so strange, because a lot of things that we saw there on the screen, they happened there 20 years ago, just only 100 meters from outside, because the theater is right next to the parliament, where the scene, for example, is
of the protests.
Yes, of the protests and the demonstrations and the people dying and And it was really emotional for everybody, and for me, of course, also. So that's why I'm kind of hopeful that people are really, there is a huge interest. So
there's openness also for the nuances that you write in your book about the good and evil side of things, also in Georgia, that people are receptive to that nuanced aspect of it.
I would like the idea, or I like the idea if there were going to be a kind of discourse or discussion, or I don't expect that everyone is going to say, oh, it's so great. I think it will really depend on generations, because my generation or the younger ones, they're going to read the book really in different ways than the older ones. And of course there will be some conservative people saying, no, it's not the way, because a lot of Georgians, I think it's also really human, something really human. They, of course, nobody likes to be guilty, because the Georgians also like the version of being victims. Yeah. And in that book it's not quite that way.
Yeah,
so,
exactly. So I think your book in a way could contribute to that public discussion, if there is any.
I hope so, because even Georgia is trying to become more and more Western society, and there have been a lot of things happened in the last 10, 15 years, and I'm really positive about a lot of things are developing in a right way. But there are also so many huge problems and so many big problems, and one of them is dealing with the past, and I hope that if I can kind of contribute something to that issue, I would be really grateful for that.
Well, it's interesting that you mention the interest in the past. In a lot of post-Soviet or post-communist places, it seems that interest in the past has become also a little bit of an obsession with the past, and sometimes intermingled, strangely enough, with nostalgia for sometimes which on paper looks quite bleak times. So have you noticed that kind of ambiguous relationship with the history in Georgia as well, that as soon as you do something about the past, that there is something that people have particular obsessions that they like to defend, perhaps?
Yeah, of course there's some, but it also depends on generations. The younger ones, they're really very Western orientated. They don't want to look back. They don't want to deal with Russia or find a kind of, they are really strictly against everything's about just like Eastern way of, because this problem is one of the huge problems in Georgia, still the how we deal with our neighbors, just like how, because Russia is still occupying some territories.
There's frozen conflicts.
Also, conflicts, a border problem, and the younger ones are really, they don't want to deal with them.
Yeah.
Don't want to find a solution or something. They want to have a Western society, and they want to be, they want to change things and build a civil society. And so a lot of things are changing in a good way. But there are some older ones, yes, of course, who's saying that Western society is really something. It's terrible. The conservative parties or also politicians, and they're manipulating with that people as politicians who are just like more close to Russia or Russian politics. But they're in minority, I would say so. Yeah.
So, but it makes your novel quite worthwhile to have it in that discussion, I guess. So that's the reception of the book in Georgia to some extent, as far as it is already known. But then it is also remarkable to some extent that a country which, it's about universal feelings and histories, obviously, but it's also about a particular place, Georgia, which is not so well known in Germany or in the Netherlands or in Belgium, but still people are very open to the novel, it seems. Do you have any experiences to share about the reception of your novel in Western countries?
I think it's a great gift, because I was not expecting it. I was not expecting this kind of interest or success, and somehow. Even I thought, okay, because everybody was saying before the book has been published, who is going to read that? It's too long and nobody has time for it. But
people
somehow
do have time for it, apparently. Yeah.
But somehow I think it's first of all, it's a family history, and I think family is an issue that really everybody's kind of dealing with that. So it's really difficult not to have an interest in for that.
There's something immediately recognizable for the reader from the first pages on brothers, sisters, nieces, and so on.
Yes, there's the relationships and so on. And for me, it was a nice discovery that when I was meeting readers, I was touring around with that book for a long time and meet a lot of people, and they had different, because it was always like a different reason why they were interested or why they wanted to read that. Because some of them they said, okay, I'm really interested in the Eastern history, so that's why I want to read. Some of them said, no, for me it's a really tragic and dramatic history of people, of women. Also,
there's a lot of women in the book,
yes,
indeed. Yeah.
Some of them were just like saying, okay, I also have to deal with a complicated family history. People sent me a lot of letters where they've written down their family history. So I thought,
that's an interesting response. People want to write back to you about their
overwhelming, because they kind of told me really intimate stories from their family histories. So I think there are different reasons. Some of them just read it because of Georgia or Caucasus, or they were interested in that region.
Maybe, or
yes, I don't know. So I think there been like different ways to. But I owe a lot of the success to just like booksellers, because in the beginnings it was just like everybody was. Well, it's too huge. I don't have the time. And the booksellers, they started to just like no, you
Point
have
out,
to,
yeah,
and
yeah.
please do, and please read. And somehow, I really, I'm thankful to them. So
Yes, we all
said
thankful
they,
that, yes.
because a lot of people were a little bit afraid because it's too big
Yeah.
or too huge. So, but so it's a gift. You
Yeah.
cannot plan things like that, of course, and I'm really thankful that
Yeah.
it happens this way.
Great. So, das achte Leben, Georgia. What comes after the eighth life? There's another book. There are other books, perhaps, that you're writing at the moment. Can you show us or tell us a little bit about the work that has followed this novel? Because you wrote this mostly in 2012, 13, I guess, and now you've been working on other projects since.
Yes, 2018, last year, my latest novel has been published. It's called Die Katze und der General, the cat and the general.
It's not translated yet, but I think the translation in Dutch is coming, right?
Yes, they're already translating, and I'm not quite sure when, but I guess it will be published this year in Dutch. And
it's not about Georgia?
It's not about Georgia, it's a story. I guess it's a universal story, but the setting is in Chechnya, but also in Germany and in Russia, most of the parts. And I was inspired by a real story. I read books of Anna Politkovskaya, maybe she's a Russian journalist and activist. She's been murdered in 2006 in Moscow. And she been writing a lot of this Chechen wars, and there have been a story that inspired me and really had it's also a terrible story about a troop of young men in the war, and guided by a colonel he was an Afghanistan war hero, but also had an alcohol problem, and they been sent to a small village in Chechnya, and they had to spend their holidays. I mean, during the war, it's a really crazy thing because they've been first in Grozny and they've been traumatized, and everyone was like, these young men they had different difficulties, and they've been sent to the place. It was summer, and they had to spend there just like, kind of illusion of a holiday. And it didn't really, it ended up in a really big violent, how to say it, it was an explosion of all the terrible things that you can imagine. And they stormed the village and tortured people and raped and murdered because they could not really deal with peace anymore.
Right.
They could not live a normal life anymore.
They didn't know to adjust to the peaceful situation. Yeah.
So, and it became really, it was a question that I was questioning myself, that because all the young men, soldiers, they were not kind of psychopaths or murderers before, and what people makes do things like that.
Yeah,
what's
it's an
happening
interesting
there?
question, yes.
And that was the starting point for this book.
It's
But
again, it's sort of the dichotomy we spoke about earlier about the circumstances that make you do terrible things, and then how people sometimes overcome that. Those difficult
I think
circumstances.
it's not a book about Chechnya like the Eighth Life, about this book about Georgia. I did also a lot of research. I went there and so on, but it's still.
It's not a history book, or you would say.
It also has to do something with this part of history, with this perestroika time and this Chechen war period. But it's still I hope it's different, of course, and. It's more because this story is really universal, because it could happen anywhere where there's been a war. It could also happen, I don't know, in Afghanistan or Syria or so on. It was just like, accidentally it was Chechnya. It's a neighbor country, and I really didn't know anything about that tiny part
So
of
again,
Caucasus.
it's for you sort of discovering a
Yeah, it
particular
was a
history.
discovering, yes. I had to really, it's also difficult because it's a dictatorship and you cannot just really go and ask people things. And so it was a big adventure, but I'm thankful that I've been able to go there and do so. But still, it's yes, I hope it's a different one. It's not just like a book about Chechnya, like 8 Life about Georgia's.
Yeah. And you are working on a new novel as well. You told me that you're going to be in residence here in Brussels for a while. Is there any clue already about what the novel will be,
yes,
or
but
is it a
it's
secret?
I'm so in the
Premature.
beginnings that
Yep.
it's a little bit difficult to talk about it. Yes.
We fully understand that, and the secrets will be even more enticing than for us. But the book on Chechnya, in any case, is being translated as we speak, I think, and so it will be on the market very soon. For those who haven't read Das Achte Leben yet, this is really something you can already buy and read, and in fact you can already buy it over there in the corner and start reading right away, which I would recommend you to do. Nino Haratischwili, thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you.
It was really great.